Our lives are busy, fast-paced, congested. We have become accustomed to looking past one another, distancing ourselves from human touch, seeking instant gratification. We live in a world that is moving so fast that people are ignored, marginalized, cast away, forgotten. 30 years ago, our founders saw that their friends, neighbors, families, people were getting left behind with nowhere to sleep at night. It was from these humble beginnings in a church basement that the seeds of House of Hope were planted, establishing strong roots and flourishing into a robust nonprofit that it is today. We now provide services to close to 1,300 individuals a year through 9 unique, life-changing programs that support upwards of 135 people in housing. Shower to Empower, a first in its kind in the entire country, brings to life our goal of meeting people where they are through showers, haircuts, and medical care to those who would otherwise go without. Shower to Empower provides something else, a moment to stop, deliver care, offer dignity, make a fresh start.
I know the systems are failing people. I know that the problems that exist right now are not because the people have created problems for themselves. And I strongly believe that everybody is deserving of dignity, respect, basic needs like housing.
All individuals have unique strengths and challenges, and our services should be built around these individual needs. Believing the greatest impact is made when we work as partners with those we serve. Our core value remains that everyone experiencing homelessness has inherent worth, is seen, noticed, valued. And we strive each and every day to restore dignity and respect.
And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Network at coalitionradionetwork.com, facebook.com/the Coalition Radio, on the mighty, mighty Twitter at coalition_radio. This morning I had the opportunity to spend time, as I often do, in following, if you will, the governor of Rhode Island, in this case Dan McKee, and this morning's press event was held at an organization called the Elisha Project. And if you're not familiar with them, they are what I call about a 10 or 12-year overnight success, in that what had been a very effective food solution, if you will, for those operating under difficult circumstances has increased significantly in the wake and the blast furnace that is Corona/COVID-19. And they were the happy recipients of a grant from the state of Rhode Island and the Rhode Island Foundation because of their effectiveness in not only delivering food, quite frankly, but also their effectiveness in delivering vaccinations to marginalized communities. The partnership of the state of Rhode Island and the Rhode Island Foundation is providing grant money to those organizations who are effectively supplementing the state's efforts. And so on that note, for a whole lot of people, the Elisha Project is, and of course is, an amazing success story. They deliver tens of thousands of pounds, if you will, of food all over the state. I've run into their trucks in Woonsocket, Pawtucket CF and down towards below Providence. And the entire political universe was there, of course, giving praise. Mr. Louis Yip, who's a fixture in the city of Pawtucket, he leads an organization that actually donated, in addition to the state grant, another $10,000. And people were justifiably happy and proud of the accomplishments of this organization. But as I was driving away, I had one of those epiphanies that you have always about 10 minutes too late sometimes, because you want to ask a question. And that perfect follow-up question always, when you do what I do, always haunts you. Mm-hmm. We're celebrating the success of this, and yet no one had the presence of mind to ask, how can we celebrate fundamentally, and this is certainly not taking away from the efforts of the Outrage Foundation or any of the other organizations that do literally the Lord's work here in this state, but how can we be so almost ecstatic in the success of an organization whose underlying fundamental need, their reason for existence, if you will, is based in human tragedy, human sorrow, and human suffering. And that in the year 2021, here in the state of Rhode Island, just literally miles away from arguably, even post-COVID, one of the hottest economies known to man in this nation, and if not this world, of course, Boston, Massachusetts, that such fundamental need, such fundamental deprivation exists to the point where we have to have folks like my guest, who I'll introduce in just a moment, and folks, like Mr. George Ortiz, who I had an opportunity to interview briefly. We'll meet with him next week. The notion that we need our guest tonight and folks like the Elisha Project is so troubling to me that I was sort of in horror that it just never occurred to me during all the pomp and the circumstance and the laughter and if you will, the rhetorical high fives, that were it not for my guest's organization and were it not for the Elisha Project, the state of Rhode Island, I believe, would be in fundamental collapse. And anyone who thinks I'm exaggerating doesn't spend, and I'm not trying to elevate myself to anything other than the fact that someone who spends a lot of time in a lot of places, boots on the ground, as we like to say here. And ironically, that's one of their terms as well. So with that in the back of our minds tonight, I had already invited to have a conversation with our guest tonight, Laura Jaworski. She is the executive director of the CDC House of Hope. It's as the video discussed, a 30-plus year organization that's become a fixture in this state and resolving some of the same issues. And I don't doubt for a moment that there's a great deal of overlap in terms of the clients, if you will, the customers, the folks that they're supporting between the two organizations. So before we even get started, Ms. Jaworski, Laura Jaworski, Executive Director, are you troubled by that same concept, that same revelation? Well, it's revelatory to me. I have a feeling it's not revelatory to you. Does that bother you?
Thanks, Pat. I think that's a really great frame because it does bother us. One of the things that we hear a lot about in terms of misconception around people experiencing homelessness is that it's a choice, right? People are making choices in their lives that end them in a homelessness situation. And in fact, what you're driving at is that homelessness, food insecurity, poverty, all of these things are policy choices in our country. And they're not by somebody's personal fault. Nobody that we have worked with sets out and has, says, I'm going to, be homeless. People certainly are marginalized in our society, in our country, and are working against major inequities. And so it's deeply troubling that we have to do this work. And in fact, many of us often dream of the day when we put ourselves out of business, and what keeps us motivated to keep showing up day after day to find solutions to end homelessness.
The language has been upgraded. I'm old enough to remember the heyday of one George Carlin, who would start out his skit, and this, of course, I can't possibly do justice to his technique, so I won't try. But in the 1960s, pointing out the notion that the term military intelligence was not, in fact, a big joke on all of us was quite controversial. And we, in an attempt to, I think, in a good-hearted attempt to provide dignity to the people that are provided services like House of Hope, like Elisha, like last week when we had Mr. Macy on, who works closely with the Johnny Cake Center in Southern Rhode Island. We assign a lot of terms to it, and I do this as well, which, while providing, I think, and it's well-intentioned, I think it's a great idea, it provides a sense of dignity to these situations. You know, back in the day, my father's 98 and lived through the Great Depression and lined up at soup kitchens and, lived in conditions that were not unlike, say, the Bowery or all the horrors that we see that we think are just, props or sets for a movie, lived through it, and then actually saw his engagement in World War II as a positive in his life because it allowed him the opportunity to eat meals 3 times a day. Imagine that. Yeah. We've sort of, I wonder if folks are aware, and listen, I'm a middle-class guy who lives in the burbs. I wonder if folks are aware of the sheer horror, the sheer, if you will, precipice that the state of Rhode Island and so many other parts of the country, I'm not going to just assign this to the state of Rhode Island, but so many areas in this country are living, and individuals are living literally on the verge of, I call it, a nervous breakdown. And I'll point to, and I have a feeling you remember these images. Just a few years ago, the Washington Post did a piece on Woonsocket. And if you're old enough to remember the images that came out of Appalachia in the 60s, when you saw the black and white photography that took place in this article, it's up there, by the way, Google it, Washington Post, Woonsocket, Rhode Island, it'll come up. There were dozens of pictures there that were in black and white, probably intentionally, that were resonant, if you will, of Appalachia in the 19th. And this is happening in Woonsocket, and the story centered on the first day of the month, and literally started at the break of dawn, or in one case at midnight on the first day of the month, because that's when the EBT cards rolled over, and that's when a lot of folks took time from their whatever employment they were able to muster and lined up literally outside of a 24-hour Walmart. So I'm not trying to be gloom and doom here, but yeah, I am, because that's how close to the edge so many people are. And we'll get into this. I don't doubt for a moment that the events of the past year and a half have pushed groups of people who are not familiar with having to live hand to mouth day to day into difficult situations. And again, here I am again, using euphemism, right? So with all of that, I'm going to turn, in a sense, a lot of this over to you now. You've got a real life perspective on it. Where I sometimes I feel in being part of the quote unquote independent media in the state, I'm a little bit of a voyeur. I'm out on the outside, kind of looking in on that. I'm the guy sitting in the restaurant while people are outside staring into the windows. If you will, give us a little education in your organization, how it started, what its purposes are, but just as importantly, how close to the edge are we? And then we're going to talk about tonight a project that's slated to begin in Providence that has elicited a great deal of controversy, and I wanted to give your organization sort of an open mic, if you will, to talk about the development of that project and what it has the opportunity to provide people. So I hope that's a good introduction.
Take it away. Yeah.
Take it away.
Well, thanks. Thank you. Well, House of Hope started in the late 80s by our founder, Jean Johnson, she, along with a number of her close friends, were really motivated by the lack of emergency shelter options for families. So in those days, if you were a family experiencing homelessness, you had no options over the weekends. We had a really disjointed and thin emergency shelter response system. And so they started as a real grassroots effort, working with a series of churches in the city of Warwick, suburbia, Rhode Island, so to speak, that is not necessarily a space that is often affiliated with families in need. And so what they did is they created a series of night-to-night emergency shelters in church basements, offering people, families, a safe place to stay. And from there, that's how our roots started. And from there, we've grown. And so we still maintain our main office, our sort of headquarters, so to speak, in the city of Warwick, and have done a significant amount of housing development and housing-based services in the city But many folks often are familiar with House of Hope CDC by the homeless services side of our work, which is statewide, reaches statewide. And so that is, we have street-based outreach programs. We have our Shower to Empower mobile shower truck. We have a youth outreach program that focuses on 18 to 24-year-olds experiencing homelessness who are LGBTQ as well. We have a workforce development training program that is usually up and running pretty robustly, that unfortunately was grounded with COVID. And then, as I mentioned, we also have a bit of affordable housing development that we have, where we've actually worked mostly in the city of Warwick to develop properties and turn them over and make them affordable housing options here, and retain them and own and operate those and oversee them. So we're a small but mighty organization doing really important, significant work, mostly with folks that are what we call chronically homeless. So folks that are homeless for a long period of time, and also have their experiences compounded by other traumas throughout their homelessness journey. And so oftentimes folks are also, not as a primary, but as oftentimes a subsequent event, a trauma that they faced. And they might be also managing behavioral health challenges or substance use challenges, medical challenges, certainly. But to kind of frame all of what House of Hope is and what all we do, and really what's been consistent in our work is really embracing the fact that housing is a basic human right, and starting from there as our ground zero. And then from there, what we do is we really work with people around the trauma of their homelessness experience, work to empower our constituents that we're working with. We also work to have high impact innovative services, one of which you saw in that video. Shower to Empower is a great example of that, creating diversified housing options. And then lastly, because we feel very strongly we can't just be providing direct service work, we actually need to be part of the solution. And so we very much embrace advocating and addressing policies around the structural inequalities that people experiencing homelessness face. So that typically will run the gamut beyond just things like recently source of income discrimination that really is prohibitive people from getting and securing affordable housing, or housing, in general. But we're often doing a lot of other initiatives that also is impacting our constituents on a day-to-day basis, and really trying to make kind of the system, so to speak, better for them.
You know, it's interesting. The Wall Street Journal, of all places, did an article a few years back, and they talked about one of the two most fundamental, most core issues associated with housing insecurity. And they talked about, obviously, food, but they also talked about sleep. And the ability of an individual to have restorative sleep, which of course requires a home, requires some functional housing environment, impacts everything from obviously their health, their ability to associate, to work with folks, to maintain the kind of schedule necessary that you need to sort of work with folks like yourself to break out. In one hand, this is possibly the most obvious question of all time, but if you could speak to that, and how difficult those two things are to break through, so that you can at least begin to compete or work towards attaining normalcy. Is that even a word anymore? If you could speak to that for just a second.
Yes, we talk a lot about wellness and what the value of sleep is and what it can do. And in fact, I really appreciate that you elevated that, because a lot of times it's associated with a lot of other things. And, you know, one of our case managers in our permanent supportive housing program talks a lot about how when people first move into housing, they sleep for a week, quite literally, because they are not used to having a space of their own, a door that locks, a place to put their things down. They are not fearful of, you know, somebody coming in and assaulting them in the middle of the night, or being rousted from sleep with a move-on tactic or strategy. And so it's very important to us to really embrace that component of it, which is what led us to really be pushing for our Echo Village concept, and really talking a little bit more about that in a minute, I'm sure. But what that really does, giving someone a space that is out of a tent, out of a vehicle, and in this safe space for themselves that can be their own, where they can leave valuable personal effects. They can make it home-like, but they can really stabilize. And when we talk about stabilization, we're talking about wellness. And when we're talking about wellness, we're talking about self-care and really addressing people's trauma. And a lot of that comes down to having good, solid sleep. People aren't eating well. They're moving around frequently. They're often carrying things with them. And they're really not able to have they have their own rhythms of their days, but it doesn't really support wellness in a lot of ways. And people are really in a survival mode and really trying to break into more of a wellness mode.
You know, when we look at statistics and, damned statistics, right? You can roughly divide your world into obviously two areas. And again, this is simplistic at first until your issue is one of the ultimate, what we call here, the onion issues. As you peel away layer after layer after layer, it just becomes more complex, more nuanced, more shades of gray. What was the state of homelessness, if you will, going into, remember those days that seemed just not that long ago? It's been about a year and a half where the world was somehow shinier and brighter, and people actually skipped on their way to work and danced, and we all broke into Busby Berkeley-like production numbers in the middle of the street, right? That's almost what it seems like a year and a half ago, and now we've entered this permanent gray stage. What was homelessness like before that, and now a year and a half into what we call here the plague? What are you seeing in terms of populations, and breakdowns and impacts?
Well, I know I certainly hope I don't want to go back to those days, because those were very gray days for us already. Our homeless service delivery system, our home emergency shelter system was already incredibly strained. Homeless service providers in this state were doing amazing, incredible work. I work with incredible colleagues that are doing incredible work in insurmountable conditions. And so when COVID hit, two things really happened. It really allowed organizations that are rooted in chaos constantly, meaning the people that they're serving are managing lots of chaos in their daily lives, to really draw on that strength and help people navigate this sort of new normal, if you will, this phrase, right? But the other thing that happened is that we got an even further supply issue in terms of resources, with an increased demand. And so we saw things happen in the beginning, those first, few months of COVID, where we were still learning a lot about the virus. We didn't know much of anything, how it was spread, if it was a serious thing. There were lots of lessons that we were still learning, and we ourselves were positioning out in the community as sort of ad hoc public health workers. But one of the things that happened is, because there's a physical distancing requirement that says everyone must be 6 feet apart. In congregate shelter settings and congregate living settings, it's 3 feet. But what that still meant was that many of these shelter spaces that were already filled to capacity had to pull beds out, quite literally. And so we saw close to 150 emergency shelter beds come offline in our state in those early months of the pandemic. And so for us, it has become even more difficult. Many more people have become afraid to come into emergency shelter because they have significant underlying medical conditions. Shelters oftentimes are not safe spaces for them. They're further traumatizing and triggering spaces. And then when you have people in masks and PPE, especially those early days when we were really heavily donned, that can be incredibly traumatizing and triggering for many of the folks that we serve. So there was, as you said, that onion, and instead of peeling the layers out, it was like adding even more layers in, so to speak. And so now we've seen the numbers, people living out in tents. We've seen an explosion in what are called vehicle stayers, so people sleeping in cars and RVs, and a real fear, a very real fear, because COVID is still very much a real threat for people experiencing homelessness, even though, we have vaccination access. It feels becoming a little more normalized too. Now that vaccines have been widespread, but it's still people very afraid of this virus, very afraid of these congregate settings and the unknowns and what it will mean for them, and especially now with this resurgence in the Delta variant, it feels like there's a flashback to where we were with some of the surges and cases that we've had in the last year. So, the net was really frayed before, and this pandemic really frayed us even more. And, one of the things that's really interesting, and you said this with the lead up, and how great groups like the Elijah Project were really turned to in the pandemic. People who, there are lots of people that relied on nonprofits like them and ourselves before. And then many more people, right? People who sort of never, ever thought they were going to need help, all of a sudden were coming in. And so there was a normalization that was happening in terms of, like we saw in the Great Recession, oh, it's hitting me now. And now I understand this. And now I've sort of had this personal awakening to the struggles of other humans. But one of the things that has also happened is that we as a society are used to only providing solutions for those deserving few, right? That new crop of people coming in, because we have ingrained in our society things that support people to help folks like that, right? But only further marginalize others. And so we saw this with the Great Recession. And my fear is that we'll see this again now, and that the people who are the most needy, the hardest to reach, the people who we were already really having struggles with providing with resources will get further forgotten, and it'll get it'll be more deeply rooted in challenges to try to come up with solutions, because we'll only, decide that we can serve these folks and not get really down to the bottom of it, which is where the solutions really need to be targeted.
It's here we have a situation where, the supplies and stocks and availability of food taken so for granted by, I'll call it conventional America, all of a sudden became an issue for all of us. We were confronting for the first time in literally about 100 years, empty shelves. So there's fear took over mainstream America of almost a survivalist mentality. Dog eat dog kind of kicked in as people fought over stocks of masks and toilet paper. It was one of these dystopian teenage movies come to life, and no one was laughing, and there were no brave figures to emerge from a local from a local high school to save us all, was there? And so even when the basics, I'll call it, aren't available to the greater population, then certainly I would imagine the appetite to support others. And by the way, there were heroes in this, and who didn't just look to their own basic day-to-day needs, and who still continued to support people. But the dreadful irony here is that as food became less prevalent, you're forgetting about those who have nothing. As shelter became riotously more expensive and less available in this state, you're all of a sudden worried about how you're going to find a home or find an apartment, and you're thoroughly middle or working class, whatever the cliche is. I just want to bring it up as an aside, and you alluded to it, car living. I saw the movie Nomadland, and I spend a lot of time on the road. And I'm one of those people that, you see the commercials on TV, right? You see the guy changing in first class because he was on his way to Frankfurt from a business trip, and then he got out of the airport and got turned right back, and he's going to Geneva, right? Well, I'm the guy who starts to get back and from Camden, New Jersey, and gets on that car and is on his way to Lowell, right? With trips in Pawtucket and West Warwick to begin with. So I spend a lot of time. As an aside, one of my favorite books of all time is John Steinbeck's only nonfiction novel, Travels with Charlie. I read that as a very young person, and that gave me a love for the road, a love to see things. And the things I've seen in the last 2 or 3 years are ugly. And one of them is this, and I have to say, this romanticized version of van living, that No Man Land, and a lot of folks found that movie to be harsh, and I found it not harsh enough, not even remotely harsh enough. There are places all over Rhode Island. I know several of them. I will not say where they are because I don't want to see these people get disrupted. And I would just say as an editorial, if you see an encampment, if you see a car living situation, do not run out and report it to the authorities. And that's I want your take on this. Offer them help in a dignified manner. Perhaps, if you can, if it's an area that you go through routinely, make them aware of resources that might be available to them. But I know at least two, and I'm not talking about the ones that have been on the news, that have been disrupted. And it's not like these people leave, and they are people, by the way, leave these car encampments and say, hey, you know what, let's head home after all. This has been, this has been a fun vacay. What do we call it, a staycation along the interstate. Let's head back now. We're all set with this. No, they have to find someplace else where there might be available bathrooms, available facilities, some level of electricity or some level of power that's safe. This is sort of the newest take on homelessness. Maybe it's new because I've just seen it the last couple of years. What are your thoughts about all of that? Have you seen the movie Nomadland?
Not yet. It's on my list. I'm still catching up after the year and a half we've had. I'm way behind on some of my pop culture stuff, but I appreciate your comments because that's a really important. That's an important component to our work in that we don't disclose encampment locations at all. We try to honor someone's privacy.
Right.
And we've lost some allies in that really don't understand. So perhaps they weren't really allies at all. But really don't really understand why it's important and why you don't really need that, right? To help somebody. And I think your guidance is really wise, Pat, in that, rule number one, people ask us all the time, what do I do when I see someone that I suspect is housing insecure, perhaps experiencing homelessness or is in somehow need help? And step number one is just acknowledge that person's existence and see them as a human, like you said. That human transaction is really important. Our folks are looked past and beyond all of the time. They were already socially distanced before social distance was the thing. People avoided them. People didn't see them. And so for us, it's really important that when we talk about dignity and respect, that's what we're talking about there. And so I think getting to know who some of the nonprofits or the agencies in the area, we're certainly always more than happy to be involved. So people can call or email me and I'll get it to the right person on our outreach team and we can try to connect with folks. Some folks don't need help. Some people do. And that's okay too. Oftentimes we're just walking up and not saying like, hi, do you want to go to a shelter? It's, hi, are you okay? Hi, how are you? And start from there. And if people wave us off, they wave us off. But if people open the conversation, they open the conversation. And that's why we try to really meet somebody literally and figuratively where they're at, and make ourselves available to them. And why we take the word outreach in that word by being out. We go out and meet people. Don't make them come in to our office between 9 to 5. We are out there in the community, day in, day out, getting people connected to whatever it is that they may need. And oftentimes it just starts with just showing up and saying, are you okay?
Thank you. Do we have number? And again, it always seems like the media's first response is, "What are the numbers?" And there's almost a sense, right? There's almost a sense, and I love your reaction to this, that when the media reports on the numbers, somehow that absolves them of any responsibility towards really reporting and investigating and understanding the numbers. That somehow the numbers represent, if you will, a complete picture. I'm a quote unquote member of the media. I'm what you call the independent media. There's a bunch of us in the state, and I think of some of the folks who do an amazing job. Steve Alquist is one of them. He comes to mind. He's a pal.
I second that endorsement.
Yep. No, just an amazing resource. I learn from him all the time.
Yeah.
And there are others. what do you think is Rhode Islanders' true understanding of the numbers? I mean, the average, that quote unquote average Rhode Islander, not the bougie ones that hang out, and I always get a kick, by the way, when, the folks, the upper crusties talk about, well, you should love Rhode Island. I mean, you get to go down to, if you will, to Narragansett and dip your toes in the water and then, catch the Newport Jazz Festival in Newport. And, there's nothing quite like a night on Federal Hill. And I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. My feet on the street research tells me there's a lot of Rhode Islanders out there for whom that is pure fiction. There's a tendency by those in power to just present this Pollyannish version of our state. And I love this state. I've been here for 35 years. Ain't leaving. But there's this Pollyannish polish put on this state by those who probably have the power and the resources to, quite frankly, do better. So what are the numbers, and do you think the average Rhode Islander, not the bougie ones, but the ones who, are working 2 or 3 jobs, do you think they really understand? And let me throw in one last thing, because I'm on a running question that Sister Hildegard would already have the ruler out on me. Do you think folks in power understand how expensive it is to be poor in Rhode Island?
The quick answers to those questions are no and no. I think plenty of people do understand what it is like to struggle, right? We have lots of conversations with folks about, their parents worked hard and worked multiple jobs and the middle class struggle and against the American dream. But I think when we really talk about folks who are really deeply struggling, right? People who are spending a disproportionate amount of money on rent, and then they're managing childcare. And, I think that's the real struggle that a lot of people don't understand. And how hard and how expensive it is to be poor, how exhausting it is to be poor in our state, in our country. And like I said at the top, these are all policy choices. People don't wake up and say, I'm going to live a life of poverty. People are doing everything that they can do to make ends meet, to try to provide for themselves or to provide for their children. And they're working in a system that was designed to work against them and to keep them down, and in particular when we look at communities of color. Mm-hmm. But to go back to your question as well, what we're faced with here in Rhode Island is on any given night in Rhode Island, there's 1,267 folks that are experiencing homelessness in our state. That number is based off a count that we do required by HUD. Everyone, all of the states do this. One night in January, everybody goes out and literally counts the numbers of folks that are experiencing homelessness. We're counting folks in emergency shelter or transitional shelter or out living on the streets. And it happens all across the country on one night in January. And what it serves to do is to give a snapshot. And then that number kind of is stacked year over year over year to determine trends, right? And it gets really deep, families versus individuals, or veterans, or men, or women, or black and white, all sorts of things. What we know here in Rhode Island, that our unsheltered number has gone up 67% in the last year, which is significant. Yep. So for an agency like ours, so now we don't operate an emergency shelter. We're a more of a homeless service provider, right? We're doing our street-based outreach work. We're not doing a lot of place-based when it comes to that side of the organization. So for us, that's a big number. That's huge. And when we back that against the last 4 years or so, that number has been close to quadrupled. That's really significant. So the numbers of people that are outside sleeping out, rough sleeping, has been going up. And that was a lot of that. Well, it was pre-COVID. So we were already on a trend. To go back to another question you asked, we were already on a trend with those numbers. Were going up and up and up. The flip side of looking at this as a problem is that it's a problem that can be solved. And for a state as small as Rhode Island, one of our greatest treasures and our attributes, it's one of the things that we joke about is one of our detriments, but it's really one of our attributes, is that we are so small and we're all so interconnected here. We're not 7 degrees of separation. It's like 1.5 degrees, right? It's like the Kevin Bacon game on steroids, right? Yep. And so we don't need to go far to either find a problem that someone else is experiencing here, but also find a way that we can work towards a solution. So on the one hand, we can look at other communities across the country that have, 10,000, 20,000 people experiencing homelessness. Our number is here for the state. That's a completely solvable problem. And so we as a state should be able to come together and not just really do the one thing that ends someone's homelessness, which is make housing. But there's a lot of other things that we can be doing as a state to really meet someone's basic needs when they need them to be met, and to really try to get involved before someone ends up in a real chronic homelessness situation.
Folks, if you're just joining us, Laura Jaworski is here. She is the executive director of the CDC House of Hope based in Warwick, Rhode Island, a 30-plus year organization that responded, if you will, to the lack of availability of day housing, and that has exploded into a range of services. We're facing, particularly after I get into my next issue, we're facing a time where, despite the stock market exploding, despite housing prices going through the roof, despite all of this, we are facing a time where the utter destruction of the middle to, and I hate these kind of terminologies, but they express an economic reality. The middle to lower working class communities in a state like Rhode Island are being decimated by fundamental increases in virtually every aspect of living, while at the same time not realizing, if you will, much of the value in what's the stock market up to now, 200,000, or who cares? Before we get into Echo Village, there's one area I just feel the need to talk about. We live in a state where a lot of people give lip service to affordable housing. What are the great cliches of Rhode Island of the year 2021? Good paying jobs. Bad English, by the way, folks. Fix it. Affordable housing for all. Despite the state's seemingly mindless mantra, it could be like a yoga mantra, right? Affordable housing, affordable housing, affordable housing. This state, in so many different ways, from its actual legislation to its economic investments, does everything they can to destroy affordable housing. And I'll give an example. I'm, full disclosure, by definition, my political philosophy is very much libertarian. What folks don't realize, though, is that we hate corporate welfare, like really, really hate it. And we see that as one of the most debilitating aspects of what we call capitalism here now. The notion that if you give a company a big check and somehow you can, however tangentially, tie it into creating jobs, it's okay. Feed someone who's hungry, that's welfare. You're giving away, teach them how to fish. Give a big corporation a couple $100,000 for putting in 30 or 40 jobs. Well, that's economic development. My opinion, not the opinion, I guess. I'll let her speak to that. But, we constantly use something called TIF-style financing now, or we give tax breaks to developers of luxury housing. And then, to coin the phrase, or use the phrase, we're shocked. Shocked at the absence of affordable housing. And I'll use an example, and I'm not looking for you to comment on this one specifically, but in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, there are two projects going on right now. The installation of a train station, right? What's wrong with a train station, right? It's America. And the development, if you will, of a soccer stadium. Now, for those who are not from northern Rhode Island, understand that Pawtucket Central, the bucket, or CF as we call them, right? But only we can call them that, all right, represents communities that of the last, and I'm using the term loosely, affordable housing exist. People all over the state are being driven to the peripheries, and I'm not knocking these communities at all. They just, they're just not as expensive as the other ones. But places like West Warwick, parts of Coventry, South County is just losing affordable housing by the minute. But here you have a train station being developed. And the question I asked Donald Grebian at least 3 times in public now is a philosophical one. Who is economic development for? Is it the people who live here now, or the people, let's be honest, all right, the people you want to live here? And we build a train station in Pawtucket. I have no doubt it will have the intended effect, which will to create a one-way ticket from the housing market of Boston into Pawtucket and Central Falls. Great, housing property prices will rise. One problem, folks. Where are people going to live? Well, all I get so far is lip service. Well, we're working on an affordable housing. Well, fellas, you might want to hurry up because right now the price of housing in Northern Rhode Island has gone through the roof, and literally, is my rhetoric too extreme, or is it too much hyperbole here to say we're running out of affordable housing space? And what we're doing with the soccer stadium, by the way, another run-on sentence, bear with me, is we're taking land away and we're interjecting a tax-subsidized district where we are going to have sales tax pay for a soccer stadium with highline retail and luxury housing to boot in a city where no one can afford to live anymore. Mm-hmm. So I guess this is a big run-up and a big explanation for our listeners, but I often quote a very old cartoon when they say, I have seen the enemy and he is us. How much of actions like this are creating gentrification and will drive out even more Rhode Islanders?
Yeah, that's a big question. I don't even know where to answer that one, but it is. It's plain and simple. It's a huge problem. It's a huge problem. I mean, when they started to break ground for that soccer stadium, big encampment was broken up and people were displaced. And many cities and towns will employ these move-on strategies to break up encampments and to move people elsewhere. But what it in fact does is makes work like ours very difficult, and it sets our work back. And so while there's this short-term win for a municipality or a developer that says, oh, we've got our land back, right? We get these folks out of here. It makes our job harder. And our time is also really valuable. And we have such little time as it is because of the amount of work that we're doing. And when you displace an encampment, we lose touch with people and we lose rapport with folks that has taken I'm not talking days, like I just met you yesterday. Like that's not how our work works. Our work is centimeters, millimeters over time, over months. And oftentimes it's with stops and starts. And then when someone is displaced and moved on, that work stops and grinds to a halt because it's not just they've disappeared, but now they don't trust us anymore. And so it's a complete backfire. Where we often think that people are going to be forced or pigeonholed into these solutions that we think will work for them, when in fact it backfires enormously. And your point is well taken, Pat. That I think we need to be really cognizant of who economic development is for. As a soccer fan myself, that pains me to say, but looking at it as a human, when we talk about making sure that everyone has an affordable place to live, that everyone is not spending, like, so to speak, the 30% or more of their income on housing, it makes it really difficult. It's really challenging right now. And I think there's an opportunity that COVID has created. There's lots of learning. I think there's lots of things that people have been exposed to. And by people, I mean people in leadership in this state that really had no idea that perhaps there was an affordable housing crisis, or it wasn't a problem they wanted to solve. It wasn't a popular problem. It wasn't, something that might be at the forefront of an election campaign or however these things go. But, COVID, I think, has absolutely exposed the breadth and depth of the affordable housing crisis, but also how difficult it is as a nonprofit affordable housing developer to do this work.
Right.
And it takes us years to do projects because we are applying for multiple applications, chasing multiple funding sources, because we don't have the kind of assets or equity that a private developer might, where they can just come in and bang something out in a matter of months that's shiny and new and looks great. It takes us months, years to do this work. I hope.
Which is a wonderful segue into what sort of stimulated tonight's conversation, as if we needed it, right? Which, of course, is Echo Village, a project that has been long in term and quite controversial in its own right. Let's talk about Echo Village. If you, I I think we've got a
Yeah.
couple pictures or something. Maybe we can, Keyshawn, if you could bring that up in a second. But Laura, what was the genesis of Echo Village? What's the thoughts behind it? In addition to the, again, Captain Obvious here, providing housing, tell us about the scope of the project and
Sure.
what your hopes are for this.
Sure. So we actually, just before the pandemic started, we were working as an organization to explore how we could use tiny houses as a permanent housing solution. And so I mentioned one of the things that House of Hope does is develop affordable housing. We have a small pipeline, but it's a pipeline. And we had an opportunity to kick around this innovative idea. And so for us, we were looking at tiny houses as a healing space, as a place to address someone's trauma. Many of our folks, for example, really struggle with when they move into housing that shares a wall or shares a ceiling or floor with somebody, right? That there's somebody living on the other side. That's a very challenging scenario for them. So they really need something disconnected. And a tiny house can accomplish that, but they can also see all of the exits, all of the doors. And so when we think about our work as addressing the trauma that someone experiences while they're homeless, this tiny house idea really fits with our mission. So we were kicking this idea around internally as an organization, and then COVID hit, right? So we sort of put that kind of on the back burner. I mean, I feel like we don't have like a 4-burner stove at House of Hope. We have like a 24-burner stove. But we kind of moved it to the back and focused really on getting the information out, being as up to speed as we could on what was happening with the development of the COVID-19 virus, what we were learning with transmission and then resources for people. So really being ad hoc public health workers. And we were very fast to see the strain on our homeless shelter system and the numbers of folks growing on the streets, living in what we call unsheltered situations. So tents, cars, RVs, literally on the streets. We were really sounding that alarm very early on in the pandemic to the state. But in the meanwhile, we continued to do our research on creating a permanent housing solution using tiny houses. And through that research, we stumbled upon that company Pallet, which was the image that was just up. And Pallet Shelters is a company based out in Washington State. And what they do is they have created these structures. They are a 7-piece structure that was designed as a disaster response tool. They didn't start out doing this as a disaster response for homelessness. They were, doing this in those sort of natural disaster scenarios, so to speak. But what they found was that communities were reaching out to them and asking for their product as a disaster response to the emergency of homelessness. And so we were really intrigued by this idea, giving someone a safe, manageable space. That one right there is 64 square feet. But being able to be in your own 4 walls with a door that locks is a huge thing for the people we serve. Huge. For people that live in constant fear of their tent getting tossed or stolen or their car being towed, right? Having this space that's, temporary, but it locks and it's my own and it's safe and no one's going to hurt me.
Right.
Was this really an interesting idea against what we were hearing our street-based outreach workers talking about and what people were experiencing. So we took this idea right back to our constituents and said, what are the things that you need? What are you looking for? Where do you want to live? What are the things that are important to you? And we really took some thoughtful time surveying and having conversations with our constituents, meaning people who are unhoused. And that's where the notion of pursuing Echo Village was born. We put the permanent housing on hold because we were not only faced with a crisis, but then it was coupled with the COVID-19 crisis. That's where we decided we needed to have something like an Echo Village. So ECHO is an acronym for Emergency COVID Housing Opportunities, where we would set out to construct a village of 30 of these pallet structures. They can have 2 people in that size. 2 people can be in each. So we have a lot of couples, for instance, that are unhoused right now because there's 1 couple shelter in the state, the entire state, and it's always full and it has limited beds. And if you present at another shelter with your partner, you're broken up. You can't sleep with them or near them. You're separated.
And if I could jump
So
in for
there's
a
a huge
second,
demand.
you break up what is left of a family structure. Very often, one of those individuals is a primary caregiver for the other individual. Access to medicine, access to basic services is even further limited by if you will, that separation. There's nothing good that comes out of it yet. Again, there's when you in these group collaborative settings, there's a need for security and there's a need for security, and I can't think of a single more destructive element, if you will, than housing shelters, than the breakup of a family unit, such that it exists in these situations.
Yeah. And what we find is people will come into emergency shelter if they come in, and they're incredibly traumatizing settings, and people get really traumatized either by that setting, or they have been in other types of setting. They've been institutionalized or through our carceral system. And that's an incredibly triggering scenario for them. And so there are incredible barriers for them to come into a congregate living style scenario where they're in one big room with a lot of other people in a big open space. And so we hear and we listen to that very, very intentionally and think about what can we do, because there has been a lack of real leadership addressing homelessness in our state. What could we as an organization really do? Because then for us, as we talk about a lot, it's about dignity, it's about respect, and ethically, morally, we as an organization could no longer go home at night to our own homes and not try to do our damnedest to make a solution happen for people. And if we were going to be put out trying, then that's where we were going to lead this organization, where I was going to take this organization. So we have been pushing for a year now to bring Echo Village to life. And, really have it be a solution for people. Because the other part is, like, people are living in encampments oftentimes together because they can't come into those spaces. People are creating the spaces that are safest for them because there's nothing else that exists. People are banding together and creating their own communities. They're doing what we do as humans. And that means coming together and protecting ourselves and creating our own units and providing food, providing safety, providing security, providing shelter, and creating those environments that we feel is the safest option that we have available. And so oftentimes people come to us and they say, well, they're unsafe. That's not a safe living scenario. Well, it's the safest option that somebody has for them at the time. So when we really took all of this in and we were thinking about Echo Village, we first were trying to design it as an outdoor village, which is how this is done in a lot of other parts of the country. However, we ran into some significant building code challenges here because these are temporary structures. They're not really up to the building code for housing that we have here in Rhode Island, and with good reason. So we then pivoted and decided, let's set this up as an indoor village. And so we had been working to secure a large, empty big box store or abandoned mill or a warehouse space where we could set up 30 of these pallet structures inside. Also present hygiene facilities for people so they can obviously meet their hygiene needs, have our services on site 24/7, providing people with the case management that we do just really superbly. We have an incredible team that does this work. But the other piece is, being in a large indoor space, is there aren't really any places for people to have quiet, peaceful enjoyment. So we hear a lot about, well, there's people that are just all over the place and they need to get out of here. Well, people have no place to go, quite literally. Mm-hmm. There's no safe space for somebody to just be a human. And especially in COVID, those places were all shut down, quite literally. People couldn't just go sit inside of a fast food chain and just charge their phone and chill out for an hour. Those spaces were gone. And the other side of that is, when we're a state that has seasons, we have some pretty extreme ones. And in fact, this past winter, there was only one space in the city of Providence that you could go to as a warming center. And it was the lobby of a homeless service provider. That doesn't work for all people. And it's for a lot of reasons. It's not easy for everyone to get to. It's, in terms of like where it is in the city, that limited by numbers, like it just doesn't offer people a variety of choice. So when we talk about having a large space, it also allows for a warming space or a cooling space, which is also really desperately needed. So when we do all of that through a COVID lens, It really is driving at the immediate threat that that virus is presenting to the unhoused, but filling a gap in our needed system and really giving a little bit of a pressure release. So giving people a safe space to sleep at night until we can really get our act together and start churning out the affordable housing that we really need to get going to meet people's needs in our state. So that's why we're proposing this is only a solution for, 1 year. At one point it was 18 months. Now that we're at the place that we're at, we're really trying to be cognizant of how the winter season falls. We don't want to be shutting down a 1-year program in November at a time when our system really explodes with people that are coming in trying to avoid extreme winter conditions. So, but really it's a temporary measure designed to try to fill a gap until we can get our act together for a long-term solution.
There appears to be a great amount of, let me quantify that. There is a group of people who have identified themselves as opponents of the program. One of the issues that they talk about a lot, and at some point I'm gonna reach out to them this week and afford them an opportunity, if you will, in a responsible way to address their concerns. But one of the prevailing themes to be that the folks aren't from here who are doing this. That I guess because you're based in Warwick, I guess only in Rhode Island, and I'm saying this with love. I understand that they're very upset about this, but only in Rhode Island could we identify as a town 5 to 6 miles away as not being from here. And I say that with a smile. Holy cow. And I live all the way up in Cumberland. Again, I'm not probably trying to introduce levity at a bad time, but what seems to be the objections here from your perspective? Is it, and I hate when people use the expression NIMBY, not in my backyard, but is it a frustration that this is going to occur in a part of town that has traditionally been the host for these, for support structures? And how much of the need is actually coming, ironically, from that part of town?
Yeah, there's an absolute tradition and tension there around social service providers having a heavy presence in South Providence. And I think to counter, the point, and when we think about where people are from, when we look at where people are unhoused, there's a great misnomer that, people go elsewhere to be homeless. By and large, statistically, people stay in their communities when they experience homelessness. People think everyone goes out west, right? Because the weather's nice and it's cheaper when you have nothing and you can go be homeless out on the streets of LA because it's warm. It's a great misnomer of the work that we do. And by and large, most people that are experiencing homelessness stay in their communities of origin, of choice. And so I can absolutely understand too, though, that people feel as though there's a dumping that happens, especially if you're watching and witnessing a pattern of disparity that is being brought into your community. Part of what's really challenging in this is that we're also really discrediting or really polarizing the opinions of those that are housed versus the unhoused. And I explained at the top that we did a survey of our folks and asked them, where do you want to go and what do you want? And check in with them frequently on this. And people want to stay in Providence. It's a big part of where they're at. This project has taken some journeys that have led us down some winding roads where, yes, we started this project out in partnership with the city of Pawtucket, and we ran into some code challenges in that city that then led us down to the city of Providence. And, when we're looking at the type of structure that we're looking for, those aren't available in all parts of the state. And so we're talking about a 10,000 square foot building. There are only so many of those in so many parts of the state that are on a bus line that are going to be near services that people need, but also in communities that people choose to be in. People come to me and they say, well, go put it in, Burrville or Barrington. And it's you can't get there from here. And we're talking about, right? It's a really challenging scenario to talk about humans in that way as well. and where people need their needs met. And it's a constant, there's a constant tension that we're bucking up against around, we don't want those people here. And it's not that these people are already here, but these are your neighbors who happen to be unhoused that are of and from your community. And, you know, we get a lot of heat about, you know, go back to Warwick and do that there. And the thing is that, yes, our agency is headquartered in Warwick, but we have programs all across the state. We do this work statewide. We rent apartments up in Woonsocket. We run a housing program, an affordable housing program at that, in Hopkinton. We do our street-based outreach all over the state, but we rent office spaces in Providence. We're of the community, and my staff is also of the community. They either have grown up in Providence and are now choosing to do this work back in the city, or they now live there and have chosen to live there and are working hard to establish roots in the community. So there's this notion too that is, you know, this outsider mentality that at surface might feel true, but in fact is artificial. And yeah.
Talk to me a little bit about, you mentioned a couple times code issues. And again, as someone who self-identifies as a libertarian, I find that maddening, because you've got, and I think even people like myself understand the fundamental need at some level to have building codes. But at a certain point, we're also talking about survival.
Sure.
There's a tendency for someone like me to say to the same city in Pawtucket, and again, this is my perspective, and I'm not attempting to project this on our guest tonight at all, but the same city that broke ground on a soccer stadium, but still won't identify what the range and scope of the sales tax collecting district they're going to use to pay for it, or who is the backstop for it, it gets awfully picky on certain times when they want to. And this was the same crew, by the way, that objected to the legislation that extended permanently to restaurants being able to serve outside. One of the few tiny benefits that came out of this was an extension of restaurants business. So, of course, they were quick to object to that. So, you know, I'm not a huge fan of the government of the city of Pawtucket, and that's me. I want to clarify, make sure that's very clear. But forgive me, I'm from New Jersey. I'm going to break into the vernacular. F your codes.
Yeah.
You have people literally, is it within the code to be living under a bridge on an interstate highway? Is that up to code? How about that? Is it up to code to get 1 square a day? And that's being provided by a soup kitchen in Pawtucket? You know, at a certain point, is there, and I will throw one question in your way, and I'm going to make this a very general one, because it's directed at a number of communities. There are a number of communities whose mayors are, as I like to say where I come from, Denali a river in Egypt, all right? And there are mayors in certain communities in this state who remain publicly unaware that people are suffering as they project their imperial mayoralty. And I'm not just talking about that one city. There's a couple of towns like that who fail to acknowledge that there are, you know, as we say, Houston, we have a problem. Do you run into that a lot?
Yeah. And right out of the gate, there are people experience homelessness in every city and town in our state.
Right.
Like full stop. We have representation everywhere. And so there is somewhat of an equalizer there, right? That it's across the board. It's not an exclusive problem to an urban core or northern versus southern or anything like that, but it's across the board. And so, though, to the other point of your code challenge, yeah, there's been a sort of cop out in the sense of we've gotten feedback like, what if somebody dies in one of these things because they're not up to code? Well, that's a cop out. Because people are dying on the streets already. And so we're using that as an excuse to not be mobilized into action. What the difference too, and how is that, you know, we're East Coast is like 10 years behind the rest of the country, right? It takes lots of time for really progressive ideas to make their way and to be embraced culturally by the East Coast. And so one of the things that we are seeing with this initiative is that communities out west have embraced a much more progressive take on zoning, and have had a lot of political leadership to help move things away. Now that being said, I will applaud Providence Zoning, who has been an incredible partner in being innovative and at the table to really understand and embrace this project. And I'll also really give a major shout out to the Providence Fire Inspector and the State Fire Inspector, who really worked hard with us to come up with a really good fire safety plan to present to the Fire Safety Board to address that. Because the other part is like, we're blowing people's mind, right? We're asking people whose job it is to mitigate risk and liability to think outside of the box. And it's just like, it's not possible. It's like a round peg in a square hole, because the things that make them do their job well are those black and white rules. And so presenting a project like this to them really stretches the bounds of those parameters. Mm-hmm. And so I really applaud them, because they really understood and took the time to not only get the project, but understand the issue and what we are trying to achieve. And so I really applaud the city and the state in this effort that really understood and embraced this to make it happen, because it's groundbreaking. You know, what we've accomplished on that front, getting a fire board safety approval to make this project happen, is absolutely groundbreaking. It's stopped this project in other cold weather communities. And the fact that we've gotten over that hurdle, we've now set some precedent that it's in fact possible, is really enormous.
Yeah, and when you look at some of these folks, and again, I'm no fan of big government, but when you look at the commonalities between the creation of the harm reduction legislation and you tie that into some of those same jumps, if you will, in learned behavior that folks in incorporating a setup like this have had to make, it is, and we should celebrate, if you will, those folks with the courage to sort of break the norms. As an editorial mark, I have to say that this state will always, at least in our lifetimes, be scarred by what happened at the Station nightclub fire. And as a result, fire codes are some of the toughest in the nation. We had real tragedy here. 100 people died because of fire codes and the absence of enforcement. That's, going to take, I don't know that we should ever overcome some of that. Because there's a watchfulness and an awareness there as a result. And took a tragedy of unimaginable proportions, if you will, to create that. So I get it, and I see both sides. And it's good to see that in some part of the state it's working out. Where does the project stand right now? And what are, if any, exist barriers to actually completing it?
So the project is still viable, very much viable. And now we have to go back to the drawing board and identify another location for this project. So we are searching in the city of Providence for another large open space where we could establish this indoors. So a minimum of 10,000 square foot space that's on a bus line. You'd think that's silly to say, but it's true. There's lots of warehouses where you can't get there from here. And for a community that relies on public transportation, it's really important. And an owner or landlord that understands what we're doing. That's a really big piece too. And that we were blessed with who owns the property at 545 Prairie that really understands our vision and really stood by when things got really sideways. A lot of, I think, owners would run when they're talking about, you're going to have fire codes and all of this, but really stood by us and embraced our vision. So an owner that really understands what we're doing. So we've had this as a setback, but myself as the director of this organization are bringing this organization forward and saying we remain committed. And my board of directors stands behind me in that commitment. And so me and my staff are going to continue to push this project forward. It means a lot, not just to us because of what we have done to try to make it happen. But at the end of the day, it matters to the people we serve. And those are people that are unhoused in our community. And we're going to keep trying until we have run out of any and all possible options. But at least, we know that we've given it a good go. And that's what's kept us going on this project for the last year through getting through fire safety code challenges, through location challenges, having to pivot cities, having to pivot in outdoor versus indoor. We're an organization that really thrives in chaos, in crisis, because that's what our people are experiencing all the time. And so what that means is that we're really creative and we're really innovative. We are really rise to a challenge in that way, and don't see roadblocks. We see detours. And so this is an opportunity to really shine in our innovative skills and do something that is of significance to people who are unhoused, but also to bring an opportunity to the state, like we saw with Shower to Empower, with being the first mobile shower unit in New England. A real opportunity to do something different and to not do business as usual, but to really put something in play that meets people where they're at and really meets the needs of our constituents.
Right. And there are so many lived experiences and shared experiences over the years with your organization that there's an intimacy with the needs of your clients and the population that you're looking to work with that, quite frankly, an institutional knowledge, for lack of a better term, that can't be recreated. It's compelling. It's just and you're obviously an optimist. You see hope. You see opportunity. People like me don't listen to people like me. I'm the Irish cynic. Because it's so frustrating to me to see opportunities lost and to see another year go by, and to see, and it's got to be heartbreaking for you folks because you're so on such a human level with so many of the people that you're supporting that you see the lost souls, you see the permanency in some of these losses because of issues like this. Wow.
People aren't lost. We've lost them, and yeah.
Well,
what we have is people who get damaged from those systems. It's really quite awful. And I think the other part I would just add is that, our staff has done an incredible amount of work in responding to the needs of people in a pandemic. And I think that's something that I think the state and especially leadership should really be mindful of, and that the work that the nonprofit community has done this past year and a half under really insurmountable conditions.
And I guess, and I think senior management in the state, if you will, realized that lost, and I guess my theme for today was lost in the successes of the superhuman efforts that individuals like your team have made on behalf of people simply because it's the right thing to do. Lost in those triumphs is the failure at some level to perform an intervention, to perform the surgery, political surgery necessary to prevent the symptoms from happening. I fear that in our celebration of eliminating the symptoms or some of the symptoms, that we've forgotten that the disease is still there. And I know that's a kind of a cliched response, but I can't really think of a better analogy to sum up our current situation. Laura, we always end each one of these shows with, and I put a smile when I say this, with a little segment we call shameless self-promotion. And we want to, when we've had people watching this live, but we get a lot of people who watch this in reruns, and we'll package it and we'll put in links and things like that. How can folks donate to your organization? Do you have, I hope if you don't have one right now, when you have significant fundraisers, you'll allow us the grace to help you publicize them, if not participate in them directly. Simply, how can folks help?
Absolutely. So first, help, number one, by seeing someone experiencing homelessness as a person. That's first and foremost. That's worth more than $1 million. But if you want to get involved by giving your green, by all means, houseofhopecdc.org is our website. Poke around, take a look. We just recently updated it, so we're really proud of it. But by all means, you can donate that way. Follow us on social media. we like to give a nice offering and overview of all of the work that we're doing and illuminate different parts of the organization, but also raise some awareness on different policies that impact people. And then lastly, get involved, right? Like your time, your talent, your treasure. And I think there's lots of nonprofits, and House of Hope is one of them, that really need people to get involved. And so that's, volunteering, if on a day-to-day basis, if you can give your time that way. But particularly, I think, as a board member. And so if people are interested in doing board service, I'd love to have a conversation. We really need people who will lend their expertise to us in the areas in which they are competent. So that might be a professional area, but it also might be a personal area of expertise, right? If you're a person with lived experience of homelessness, those are voices that I need guiding me with the organization to be making decisions on behalf of people who are unhoused. So that's what I would offer up.
Well, Laura Jaworski, again, she's the executive director of CDC House of Hope. Thank you for spending a good part of your evening with us. We ran a little bit long, but the information was well worth it. The perspective even more valuable, and the lived experience probably the most important of all. There's a lot of folks who get it. I applaud the fact that you're an optimistic person by nature, and I look forward to staying in contact with you. And again, keep us, with like independent media. I'll put a shout out. I always promote independent media. There's a half a dozen or so players in the state. I mentioned Steve Alquist in particular, who work to serve the community and touch on some of the issues that sometimes we refer to as third rail issues, because the media, the conventional media neither has the pipeline or sometimes the desire or the willingness to get into an in-depth conversation like this. That's where we shine, because we live here. This is where we're invested in terms of a home and a community. Providence is an amazing place despite all its challenges right now. Our challenges are not unlike that of other states, but yet, given the community spirit here, almost the tribal cult-like nature of Rhode Islanders, I believe we possess the scale, the talent, the challenges, and quite frankly, the desire to fix these in a way that I don't know other places have. And so let's celebrate that, and let's get to work.
Thanks, Pat, for having me tonight.
We are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Radio Network at coalitionradionetwork.com. Should you be hearing us for the first time, we just make one simple request. If you could like us on the Facebook, follow us on the Twitter, subscribe to our YouTube page. It is by your voices, collectively and individually, that we rise above the white noise of as Bruce Springsteen put it, at this point, 3,000 stations and nothing on. We're trying to change that, and I hope you'll stick with us and work alongside of us. Folks, have a wonderful evening. That ends the programming tonight. We will be back on tomorrow night at 7 o'clock with an award-winning show called RAMP, Real Access Motivates Progress. We are proud to say that Tina Peterson, who is the host, last week did something that I don't know that I've ever seen, Laura, on television, much less independent media. On one day, she had the lieutenant governor and the governor on simultaneously, and we did a special midday broadcast. The next day, she had all 4 members of our federal delegation on simultaneously. Both of our congressmen and both of our senators took the time out, understanding that Tina's mission of providing, if you will, both the resources, the knowledge, and as someone who, and I'll never use the word confined with Tina Peterson, but someone who spends her day in a mobility device, can afford people. And I think, Laura, at some point I'm going to introduce you to Tina, because she is a force of nature.
Yeah, I know Tina already, and I agree.
Oh, okay.
She is.
Yeah, so she does it. We're very proud. She's done about 40 or so shows. We just had our 1-year anniversary here on the Coalition. That's Wednesday at 7, 8 o'clock. Chas Kalenda, attorney at law. Chas, who has 12 years experience working for the Attorney General office in criminal law, now has a private practice, gives actually real-world examples to give folks an opportunity to understand the legal system and to understand their rights. And then usually at 9 o'clock, I engage in some sort of session with somebody talking about relatively obscure yet important areas of politics, particularly the peace movement. Folks, thanks for joining us. We know you have a lot of choices and where to spend your evening. Thanks for spending part of it here. Have a great night.